The outcome of the French and Indian War affected the colonies in Western Europe equally. The French and Indian War was a 7-year-long war between Britain and France. Although fighting began in 1754, the war did not officially begin until 1756.
The two sides were fighting for the control of much of North America. This war was part of a larger war that was going on in Europe.
At the beginning of the war, France controlled Canada and the Louisiana Territory. Britain controlled most of the east coast of North America. In 1754, in one of the first battles of the war, a Virginia force of some 400 troops under 22-year-old Colonel George Washington were sent to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to remove the French from their new fort, which was defeated and sent home by a French expedition about double its size.
Both had arrived to secure the Ohio Valley, but instead of simply considering this one of many border incidents that had troubled colonial relations since the 17th century, the British government, alarmed that the French had constructed a chain of forts from Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico since the end of King George's War in 1748, decided for the first time to begin a major war over a colonial dispute. In Europe, the conflict is known as the 7 Years' War because more general fighting broke out in 1756 that pitted Britain and Prussia against Russia, France, Austria, and Spain.
The war's first major conflict occurred in western Pennsylvania. In 1755, an expedition of more than 2,000 Virginians and British regulars commanded by General Edward Braddock was ambushed and annihilated with a loss of more than 800 of his men and only 39 of the French and Indians just before it reached its intended goal of Fort Duquesne.
There were three major groups that partook in the French and Indian War. The first was Great Britain. The British mostly controlled the eastern seaboard but always wanted to expand and gain land against their rivals. But when the British were moving more west, they had found that the Ohio River Valley was inhabited by North Americans and was a main trading route with the French for resources and jewelry and so on. The next largest group to settle in North America were the French. They had most control of the entire northern territories in one or two states in the south. During this time period, they dominated the Ohio River Valley because of their large and vast trading routes with Native Americans. But in most French settlements, the majority of the colonists are of British descent.
One of the major groups in the French and Indian War were the Native Americans. They seem to have joined both parties during the war, but primarily stuck and fought with the French. The Indians were the first people to live in the Ohio River Valley, but soon they, as well as the British and French, will be competing for control over it. At this time, there were between 3,000 to 4,000 natives living in the Ohio River Valley. George Washington played a very important role in the French and Indian War. He began as a careless military and diplomatic leader, but the war would soon change him. During the time he served in the military, he began to learn what it takes to become a leader, and he became strong and successful.
A major fort that fighting occurred at during the war was Ticonderoga. It was a French-controlled fort. The British tried multiple times to take it but couldn't, but then in 1759 they had finally succeeded. William Johnson was well known for his skills in trading with the natives. He also led the British to a victory at the Battle of Lake George. Marquis de Montcalm was a leader of French troops in the French and Indian War. He was also the commander of the French at the Battle of Quebec in 1759. This is where General James Wolfe of the British Army caught the French off guard at the fort, and the French fled to Montreal.
The Battle of Quebec was an epic struggle in itself. The French had thought that they were safe in their fort high on a cliff, surrounded by easily defensible plains and sea. Instead, British troops had somehow climbed the 300-foot tall cliffs under cover of night, and French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, sent his troops out onto the plains of Abraham to do battle, and the English troops prevailed. Battle of Quebec was a British victory and a British loss. General James Wolfe was killed in the battle. In 1757, in the American colonies refused to serve under British commander Lord Loudoun. The new British commander closely managed the war effort, demanding American colonists to recruit money and to give efforts to the war. Colonial assemblies began to refuse to cooperate. In 1757, in New York, Fort William Henry had a great battle. The Indians took over 310 British captive and killed 185 of them. This was following the surrender of the British. In 1760, French surrendered in Montreal, Canada. This was the final battle in the Americas.
There were two treaties signed after the war. One was the Treaty of Paris, and the other was the Treaty of Hubertusburg.
The Treaty of Paris was between the French, British, and Spanish. France lost all claims of Canada to the British, gave Louisiana to the Spanish, lost an African colony by the Senegal River to the British, but kept some small islands in the Caribbean and on the St. Lawrence River. Britain gained Spanish Florida, Upper Canada, and various French holdings overseas. The treaty ensured the supremacy of Britain and strengthened the 13 colonies. For the Indians in the Ohio Valley, the British victory was disastrous because most sided with the French. The Iroquois tribe allied with the British and ended up controlling the Ohio Valley for the next 50 years, but never was in the position to deal with their white rivals. Britain ended up in debt and tensions began between them and the colonists. However, there was a Treaty of Hubertusburg was between the Austrians and the Brandenburg Prussians. This ended up with Austria gaining nothing and Brandenburg Prussia keeping possessions of Silesia.
David Walbridge, Vermont University.
Jason Knopf, Kingwood State. Max Rosero, Harvard University.
St. Michael's Hall.